be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 18th part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfictionnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. The Ravenclaws and Slytherins leaving their charms class were puzzled that the entire Gryffindor and Hufflepuff first-year cohorts were waiting. Not only were they there already, but most were sitting and had clearly been waiting for some time. Draco, yet again flanked by his pals Crabbe and Goyle, gave Harry and the fillies a long look before sneering and stalking away. After most of the Slytherins and Ravenclaws had left, Harry and the fillies went in, with Scuttaloo trying to hang back and pretend she didn't know what was going on. Hermione and Ginny managed to stay just far enough back that they could escape notice as they headed for chairs. Professor Flitwick was a tiny little wizard who stood on his desk, with a staggered pile of books stacked beside it to form a convenient staircase. Harry frowned, wondering why he hadn't just made a regular staircase and platform instead of obviously making do with the materials at hand. He had been here several years and that should have been more than enough time to customize the arrangement to his satisfaction. Maybe those books were by authors he disliked. From her expression, Hermione was more than a little offended to see that someone would defile books so far as to actually walk on them and reduce them to the level of mere flooring. That it was a professor doing so merely increased the depth of disrespect displayed to those undeserving tomes. Harry shrugged, having seen the elaborate bookforts Twilight tended to make when she was stressed. But those were walls, not floors, weren't they? The professor was surprised to see his next class start filing in almost before the previous one left. Yes, he said to the 4 students as they came up to his desk. Can I help you? Apple Bloom pushed Scuttaloo to the forefront. Scuttaloo had on her innocent face, trying to give the impression she was just an innocent bystander in the latest Cutie Mark Crusader fiasco. She cleared her throat. Professor? He nodded encouragingly. She took a breath. We were just in History of Magic and Professor Binns left. Left? Inquired the puzzled professor. Yeah. He, passed on. Passed on. The diminutive wizard arched his eyebrows incredulously. Scuttaloo shuffled her feet awkwardly. The others held still so as not to draw the attention of their teacher, a skill they had developed in the ever-free forest when evading predators. Yes. I think he said, school's out completely. For me, that is, and then flew up into the back right-hand corner of the classroom and disappeared, laughing. She waved her hand to indicate the direction and then swallowed. And now there's no one to teach history of magic. Oh dear, he said quietly and stared at the filly intently. He sighed, then waved his wand and said, Expecto Patronum. An unfamiliar silvery animal flew out of his wand and stood on its hind legs looking up at him. Go to the headmaster. Professor Binns has finally passed on and we need a history of magic teacher as of right now. The silvery beast nodded and ran off through the air and through the hall wall. All the Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs watched in stunned surprise. Most had never even heard of that magic, much less seen it. He turned to the 4 students and said, Perhaps you should start at the beginning. After their hesitant explanation, with a few comments thrown in by the other students, mostly Hermione and Ginny, Professor Flitwick introduced himself to the class. Unfortunately, the rest of the class was boring in that most of it was about wands, taking care of wands, and general magic theory. Their professor tried to make it interesting, but even so, the only spells they learned were the 2 basics, Lumos and Nox. Which Harry, Hermione, Ron, Ginny, and the fillies had mastered very early last month. There was a slight bit of excitement when Professor Flitwick saw both Harry and Sweetie Belle using their magic to take notes. They were listening intently, with one hand propping up their chins and the other on their desks anchoring their papers, as their quills quickly scribbled away. "Oh my," he said excitedly, "who taught you that?" Harry and Sweetie Belle exchanged puzzled looks. Twilight taught me last year, and Sweetie Belle picked it up from me, I guess. And that was before you got your wands, right? They both nodded and said, "Yes, Professor Flitwick." "It was a little tricky at first," Harry continued, "but the longer we did it the easier it became. Sweetie Belle learned it faster than I did because she helps her sister with her sewing, so she was used to moving needles and threads quickly with her magic." He wrinkled his nose. "Now, I barely have to think about it and the writing is so much neater, which makes it easier to read later." That turned into a quick impromptu discussion of wandless magic and how it differed from wand magic. And the benefits of being able to take notes while their hands were busy doing something else. Neither of the two pointed out the obvious usefulness of casting magic while desperately holding with all four limbs onto the safety of a branch, or galloping at full speed from certain death at the teeth of hungry pursuers. 3 points each, Mr. Potter, Miss Bell, for such an excellent display of fine control, and with wandless magic, no less. In all the excitement, no one noticed that the other two fillies were mouth-writing with their quills. Lunch started with an announcement. The headmaster struck his goblet several times to make a gong-like noise to attract everyone's attention. As many of you have no doubt heard, Professor Binns is no longer with us. He was looking directly at the Gryffindor first year's cohort as he said this. There was a brief break as shouts of relief ran through the hall. The headmaster smiled. Yes. It appears that he had not realized he was dead and a ghost all this time. I believe it was Miss Alou, in Gryffindor, that brought that to his attention. There were many interested looks directed her way. He has moved on to the next great adventure of his life after almost 200 years teaching history of magic. I am sure we will all miss him. The headmaster halted and peered over his glasses. In the meantime, history of magic classes are cancelled until a suitable replacement for the position can be found. Here's hoping the new one is still breathing, shouted one of the twins as the headmaster sat back down. And knows more than just goblin rebellions, put in the other one. The hall broke into laughter for a few moments before moving on to their lunch. Transfiguration class was fun, at first. Harry saw the cat sitting on the desk at the front of the classroom, as they all filed in after lunch, and laughed. The cat glared at him. The fillies were equally amused. They sat themselves at the front of the class, as usual. Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo sat on either side of Harry, while Apple Bloom sat behind him. The fillies had been changing positions in each class so far so that they each had a chance at watching Harry's back. Hermione and Ron traded sitting beside whomever was behind Harry. Ginny usually took the seat on one side or the other. Harry, the fillies, and Hermione grinned at each other, and at Lily Moon. She was the only other Muggle-born in the class to receive a visit from Professor McGonagall and see her animagus transformation. "What's so funny?" Ron asked. Ginny and Neville also looked on curiously. Harry, after a quick glance at the still glaring cat, grinned at him and said, "You'll see, just wait until everyone is here." Watching the other students and their astonished reactions when the cat on the desk transformed into their professor had those six snickering out loud. From their brief meetings in July, Harry had assumed that she would be a strict teacher. Her leading statement that transfiguration was complex and dangerous, and that anyone messing around would be banned, proved that, and was taken to heart by the herd. They were all very impressed when she changed her desk into a pig and back again, although the equestrians couldn't help but think of Discord's abilities. They couldn't wait to get started, but the complicated notes they had to take demonstrated that that wasn't likely to happen soon. Harry and Sweetie's wandless penmanship earned them a raised eyebrow and little else. Harry was tempted to change into his unicorn form, but decided that maybe that might be considered showing off. 3/4 of the way through the class, Professor McGonagall gave them each a match and told them to turn it into a needle. By the end of the lesson, Harry and Hermione had managed to turn their matches all silver and pointy, and earned them a point each for Gryffindor. Sweetie, on the other hand, had a nice long sharp needle with a hole for the thread at the opposite end. She got 2 points. Sweetie Belle, Harry knew, had a lot of practice with her sister helping her sew. That gave her a rather thorough knowledge of how a needle looked and felt in her magic. Harry thought he had an advantage in consciously using magic for over a year, especially for his note-taking. That made Hermione's progress all the more impressive, which he made sure to tell her. She pinked a bit at his compliments. Everyone had really been looking forward to their next class, Defense Against the Dark Arts. Harry was hoping for a few tips they might be able to use against the Timberwolves, cockatrices, manticores, and other pesky denizens of the Everfree that they had had a few run-ins with in the past. Unfortunately, the room was pretty bland when they entered, with nothing more frightening than the strong aroma of garlic. The other students who had already had his class had said at lunch that the garlic smell, which centered on his turban, was to ward off a vampire he'd met in Romania. Apparently, he was afraid the vampire might track him down one of these days. When they asked him directly, in class, about his turban, he claimed the turban was a thank-you gift from an African prince for getting rid of a troublesome zombie. Harry wasn't sure he believed that story, especially after Quirrell's evasive answer to Seamus' question on how he had fought off the zombie. Instead, Quirrell went pink and started talking about the weather. On top of that, Quirrell's lessons turned out to be a bit of a joke. Between his stuttering, stops, and half-finished sentences, it was difficult to understand anything he said. Later, the Weasley twins told the first years that the turban was stuffed full of garlic so that Quirrell had vampire protection wherever he went. Harry, again, was not convinced. Afterwards, all in all, it was a disappointing class, the Gryffindors agreed. Which was odd, they also agreed, given that their text, The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection, seemed to be a thorough and interesting introduction to the subject. They would have to take extra time in the evenings to study the text, they decided. Peeves the Poltergeist was a major nuisance that day and every day, they discovered. He would pull rugs from under their feet, pelt them with bits of chalk, drop wastepaper baskets on their heads, or sneak up behind them, invisible, grab their nose in his freezing hand, and screech, "Got your conch." Yes, he was one for pranks, he was. The three fillies had quickly adopted a triangle strategy around Harry, much as they had when they had visited Diagon Alley. Each watched their surroundings closely. Unlike Diagon Alley, here they expected an attack. Even if it was only from Peeves, it was still annoying and distasteful. Their Everfree escapades had taught them many survival techniques. With wands in hands, they were quick to use the shield spell Harry had taught them earlier that month after their experiences in the alley. Hermione, Ginny, and Ron were quick to catch on and stuck close to the equestrians. It didn't take long before the other Gryffindor Frnds joined them to present a united front. The other ghosts didn't deliberately pull pranks, but it was still a nasty surprise when one of them glided out of the door you were about to open. Or worse, glided out of a wall or floor, through you, and then on to wherever they were going without so much as a "by your leave." What made it especially irksome was that it was like being plunged into chilly water when one passed through you, leaving you with a chill to the very bones for several minutes. While it was shocking, after climbing a lot of stairs and feeling overheated, it was kind of nice, at least right now. In the middle of winter, though. The thought made Harry shudder. It would leave you freezing the rest of the day. "Thank you," Castor said to the small group of 10 men after they had boarded the small bus with frosted windows, for volunteering for this experimental procedure. "Now that the physicals are complete and you've signed the non-disclosure agreement, I can tell you that you are not going to be fitted with new prostheses using classified experimental technology, as you were told previously." He continued before they could begin to express their opinions at being lied to, "We will be attempting to regrow your lost limbs." That stopped any protests. This group were soldiers who had lost not just fingers or hands, but large portions of their limbs, from the elbow or knee down. These procedures are a joint effort between Her Majesty's government and Royal Equestrian Technologies, and are considered, at the moment, to be top secret. Please do not discuss this program with anyone not involved in it until we give you clearance to do so. You may simply say it was an experimental procedure and you don't know any more than that. We will be taking you to a new facility, in a secret location. The path to the portal now had a permanent canopy, and the walkway was much wider. The tent had been replaced by a wooden building with a transparent, but frosted, roof. With the help of some magic that Twilight called "Don't Notice It" on the tree itself, a curtain hid the tree. They simply pushed through the curtain and arrived at the portal's other side. These 10 would never realize they had left Earth. With a repeat of the "Don't Notice It" magic, targeted at the humans, they wouldn't see the enormous walls surrounding the park-like setting on the other side. The new building on the other side of the portal appeared, from the inside, to be a normal hospital facility, looking out into a small forested area. It would fool them for the few days it would take to regrow what had been lost. If everything worked as well as it had for the first group. Hermione suggested that they get an early start on their assignments after D let out, but was outvoted. "Are you kidding?" demanded Dean. "It's nice and sunny outside. And we haven't even taken a look at the Forbidden Forest. We can do our assignments after dinner." The fillies, Harry noted, perked up at the mention of the wizarding equivalent to the ever-free forest. He sighed in resignation. It was only a matter of time. Thus, they spent the next 2 hours exploring the castle's grounds. Apple Bloom stood in front of the Forbidden Forest, hands on her hips, staring into it intently. Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle flanked her. Harry and the other Gryffindors stood nervously behind them. A few of the other first-year students had taken to following them rather than walking aimlessly alone. When Harry looked back at the group behind him, he saw Percy headed their way, having seen the large group near the forest. Several other students had started to drift over, as well, expecting a little entertainment at watching Percy cow the first ties. "Don't look that imposing, does it?" Apple Bloom drawled. "Enope," said Scootaloo, getting a frowning glance from Apple Bloom. "It doesn't look scary at all," Sweetie Belle said. "Not like the Ever-Free, whatsoever." She shivered. "It's supposed to have werewolves, trolls, and giant spiders in it." "There are also centaurs and unicorns who don't like wizards or witches," said Ron, looking into the forest curiously. "At least, that's what my brothers told me. And poisonous snakes." He shuddered. "It's got a lot of dark creatures in it." "What's a werewolf?" asked Sweetie Belle. Ron stared at her. "It's a monster. They look like normal wizards and witches, but once a month during the full moon, they turn into wild mindless monsters, wolves, that hunt and kill people for fun. If you get bit by one, you turn into one of them, too." He shuddered, again. "Just once a month. And only during the full moon." Scootaloo sounded disappointed, which garnered her some questioning looks from the other students. "No manticores?" asked Sweetie Belle. Ron shook his head, "Not that I've heard." "How about cockatrices?" No. "Timberwolves?" "Hydras?" asked Scootaloo. "Not that my brothers have mentioned," he said. "Chimeras?" "No." "Tatzelworms?" "What?" "Stellar beasts like Ursa Majors or Minors?" asked Sweetie Belle, somewhat disbelievingly. Ron shook his head no. "Are you sure this is the Forbidden Forest?" Ron nodded. Harry had the oddest longing to ask if there was any Limburger in it. "Can't be all that dangerous, then," Apple Bloom sneered, "sounds more like the White-Tail Woods than the Ever-Free." "Sounds downright friendly, actually," Sweetie Belle said. "I mean, the trees don't even look slightly scary or anything." "Are you saying that Ever-Free Forest has those creatures in it?" asked Dean suspiciously. Scootaloo snorted, "Yeah, we've run into all those monsters in the Ever-Free Forest. It's just outside of Ponyville." The other students looked at the three girls incredulously. Harry snickered. "RD still teases Twilight about getting turned to stone and needing Fluttershy to use the stair to get the cockatrice to change her back." More than a few jaws dropped at hearing this. Many plainly did not believe it. Giant spiders, though, Scutellus said speculatively, staring into the forest with a half-smile. She turned to the other two fillies and grinned widely. They took the cue and the cry rang out over the lawn, "Cutie Mark Crusaders giant spider wranglers," and slapped their hands together in an awkward three-way high-five. It worked better when they were ponies slapping their hooves together. Harry face-palmed. The students around them exchanged looks, and clearly thought that the three foreigners were completely barmy. Percy cleared his throat. The younger students quickly turned to face him, most not realizing a prefect had followed them. There was a bit of a crowd now. The Forbidden Forest is forbidden for students to enter without a professor as an SCRT, he said firmly. If I hear any of you have gone into it, it'll be a week of detentions, if not a month, at least. He stared at Harry and the equestrians. And I'll be sure to inform your princesses. He crossed his arms and glared at them, frowning, and attempting to copy his mother's formidable countenance. It was a good effort, but couldn't hold a candle to Applejack or Rarity when they were on the CMC warpath. The three fillies gulped and looked innocent. It wasn't nearly as effective while they were humans, Harry noticed. The four of them nodded slowly, indicating they understood his challenge. Harry's nod was more in resignation. He knew he had almost zero chances of preventing any forest explorations. The best he could do was moderate the resulting damage. He shook his head. Sap, he knew, would be involved. This was a forest, after all. Well, at least that third-floor corridor wouldn't have any sap. He hoped. Cutie Mark Crusader Castle Explorers had been that rallying cry. He sighed. He wondered if the wizards had fire and flood insurance. Several of the listening students exchanged glances at hearing the word princesses in connection with the three unusually named girls. One of whom had managed to get rid of a teacher that day, their very first day of classes, actually. Quite an achievement, when you thought about it. It had been accidental, but still the school was now short a teacher. And the three foreign witches knew princesses, plural. As in, more than one. Harry sighed as he watched. He could almost read the other students' minds just from their expressions. There was going to be a lot of gossip and rumors about the fillies. And him. As if he didn't already have enough problems with rumors from those stupid books. Not even here a day, and already developing a reputation. He wondered how long it would take before the sight of Harry and the fillies, intent on an adventure, would send the other students scurrying for cover like the citizens of Ponyville did when they saw Scutellus zooming down the street with the other three in the cart behind her. So, said Sweetie Belle, in an obvious ploy to change the subject, werewolves. They only change once a month. Percy nodded. Why would they want to change if they turn into mindless beasts? Asked Scutellus. They don't have a choice, explained the prefect. As soon as the full moon rises in the evening, they change and become mindless vicious beasts. It's a terrible curse. The three fillies exchanged looks. Watching the moon here go through its different phases over the last month, and even disappearing completely for a night, had completely thrown their worldview through a loop. It was so unlike Princess Luna's moon, which always appeared as a full moon. Or sometimes a half moon when she was feeling lazy. Or a quarter moon when she feeling mischievous. But it was always up in some form every night. And they can't do it any other time. Harry sighed. He could almost read Scutellus's mind, only one night a month. HHT. That was nothing to worry about. Now, nightly, that would be a problem for the Cutie Mark Crusaders. Werewolves, she said softly, rolling the word around in her mouth, and giving a sly look at her three co-conspirators. Only Percy's presence prevented an enthusiastic cry of Cutie Mark Crusaders werewolf hunters, Harry knew. Percy shook his head, no. Do they hunt other animals? Only if they're hungry. So, if we were ponies we would be safe? Asked Apple Bloom thoughtfully. Neville was nodding his head in agreement, clearly following Apple Bloom's thoughts as well as Harry was. Percy frowned. Perhaps, as long as they weren't hungry, he said. You would at least have a better chance of running and escaping. He glanced at Scutellus, or flying and escaping. He paused. Not that you'll be going into the forest, will you? He said emphatically. They hastily shook their heads. They well knew the lesson that it was better to ask forgiveness than permission. A month's grounding was usually worth it if they were caught. Plus, they actually had a pretty good record at not getting caught. Naturally, their sisters and relatives didn't know that little fact. Just asking, Sweetie Belle said, hypothetically speaking, that is. In case we saw one. They are supposed to be in this forest. So, it could happen. Percy maintained his disapproving glare. Right. Wait a minute, said Dean. What do you mean, if you were ponies? Are you saying you can turn into ponies? He asked incredulously. The three fillies looked at their friends and smirked. Harry sighed. He was doing that a lot lately. Scootaloo snorted. A moment later, a small orange Pegasus with a purple mane was flapping her wings above the group. The gasp from the watchers echoed off the castle walls far behind them. There was a brief burst of giggles and snorts from several of the first eyes. A few seconds later, half the Gryffindor cohort had transformed into unicorns, Pegasi, or just ponies. After a moment's stunned silence, the girls watching all reacted the same, loud excited squeals followed by dashing forward and grabbing one of the ponies. So cute, was the loud cry, followed seconds later by, so fluffy. Harry, fortunately, he thought, managed to dodge his closest starry-eyed fan and took off running for the castle. Coward! Ron yelled after him as he struggled in the arms of a big second-year Ravenclaw girl. The boys watched in shocked silence. Percy just sighed and kept watch on the forest. Scootaloo's hovering above them allowed her to launch herself higher and evade the two girls who had leapt up at her. She laughed as Ginny struggled to escape the clutches of a surprisingly strong, for her size, Hufflepuff first year. The boisterous group at the edge of the forest with a Technicolor miniature Pegasus flying overhead drew attention from all over the lawn. Several upper-year girls broke into runs at seeing the small red and gold unicorn with a black mane and tail racing across the lawn towards the castle entrance. The strategy of running for the castle had a major flaw. The closer he got, the more girls there were who saw him. Which quickly led to him getting trapped in a circle of admiring, cooing fans. Ah, bollocks, he said. Just as they were closing in, he transformed back. The girls stood around him, stunned. You're a wizard. You're an animagus. Merlin's sack. Change back. Yeah, change back. Maybe later, Harry shot back at them. I gotta get my friends. He turned and started back towards the group. The older witches followed him. The group was much larger by the time he arrived. Percy had arranged a system. Each girl was allowed only 5 minutes to cuddle with a pony before she had to let someone else have a turn. He convinced Harry to participate by saying how unfair it was to his friends. Harry almost challenged him to transform as well, but decided that because Percy was the one enforcing rule upon the mob, it would be better not to. Who knew what it might devolve into if he lost control? Plus, Percy might like to keep that secret a bit longer. He could hold that over the prefect if he did catch them doing something that was not exactly in the rules. Maybe. Well, it would be worth the shot. Girls were going for their third or fourth turn an hour later when the Percy announced they had to head inside to wash up for dinner. Naturally, the main topic in the dinner hall were the Gryffindor first year's animagus forms. Talking Technicolor unicorns, Pegasi, and normal ponies were unheard of in wizarding history. The Slytherins tried to make fun of them as multicolored freaks. However, that fell flat in the face of their obvious envy at the Gryffindor first years having a skill so few adults ever mastered. Plus, what that meant for the Gryffindor's magical power. That two of the hated BLD traitor Weasley children were animagi had major implications in the social strata of the pure BLD faction at the school. Harry suspected that Professor McGonagall was going to get a lot of requests about her mentoring students to become animagi. During dinner, Harry noticed, Professor McGonagall seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time glaring at the headmaster, who seemed rather uncomfortable at her expression. Naturally, he couldn't hear any of their conversation, but Professor Quirrell and the greasy-haired professor to one side seemed highly amused. The other professors appeared a bit worried at the drama on display involving the normally staid Transfigurations professor. Abruptly, she half-turned to speak with someone behind her chair. After a grumpy glare and clearly a few furious words, Professor McGonagall came over to her first years. They were puzzled at her approach. Harry didn't think they had done anything to get her attention. She stopped behind Neville. "Mr. Longbottom, Mr. Ollivander is here and would like a brief word with you. Follow me, please." Neville looked shocked, and almost tripped as he hurried to catch up with her. Harry exchanged grins with the girls. They knew that the wand maker wanted to meet and measure Neville for his new wand and check to see what wand he currently was using. By this time next week, Neville would have a new wand. After dinner, the first years all gathered together and started tackling their classes' assignments. History of magic, naturally, was ignored. Charms wouldn't be all that difficult, Harry decided. The explanations in the book's magical theory and the standard book of spells plus what Professor Flitwick had covered in class made it rather simple, actually. The fact that he had used the book manifestation spell earlier in the month to walk through all his books had given him a sufficient grounding in the basics for almost everything. All he needed now was to refresh his memory a bit and look for things he might have missed. He carefully arranged his books, parchment, and quill so he could take notes while he was bookwalking, if necessary. It was only when Sweetie Belle said, "Harry, you have got to teach me that spell," to his magical theory book that the others looked over. Sweetie Belle was holding Harry's book. The amount of homework, or was it dorm work, assigned had been considerably more than what they had ever experienced back in Ponyville. If Harry was correct in bookwalking's advantages over mere reading, it would certainly be worth a try. Plus, it actually looked like it might be fun. Hermione, sitting beside her, was the first to notice. She gasped in shock and practically tore the book out of the other girl's hands. "Harry," she exclaimed incredulously. A tiny voice came from the book as the others began to crowd around. "Yes, Hermione." His voice had almost no bass to it and was very tinny and difficult to hear unless you were close. "Why," she yelled at the book, "how?" That attracted the attention of several older students. There, inside a small box on the page, with the text squeezed around it, was Harry, in full color, looking up and out at them. "Well, as Twilight told me, you would be amazed at the things you learn when you're in a book," he said somewhat smugly in his tinny voice. "Things are just clearer. You get a better understanding of what the author intended. The spells are just so much easier to follow. And you remember things better. Not to mention that usually there aren't any distractions." "Out," she ordered him. "Now." Harry sighed. "Yeah. Well, I'm done in here now." Suddenly he was sitting in his chair. "Avadakedavra!" screamed the 4 Gryffindors closest to him. "Avadakedavra!" screamed Harry in response, causing a few other smaller shrieks to echo around the room as the more excitable students screamed in reaction to the other screams. After a few moments of heavy breathing with his hand on his chest, Harry said, "What is wrong with you people? You'd think you'd never seen magic before." "Harry," said Hermione sweetly. Sweetie Belle hurriedly dodged out of her way as the other girl inexorably moved closer to the boy. Harry looked at Hermione and swallowed nervously. Her eyes were a bit wider, and her hair was bushier than normal. Harry remembered when they were in Diagon Alley and him thinking she was like Twilight. Well, her current expression and state made him wonder if they were secretly siblings. Although how that would work across dimensions, he wasn't sure. But siblings. Yeah. Definitely a possibility. "How did you do that?" she asked calmly with the focused stare and forceful tone of someone who will not be denied. She ran her hands along the lapels of his robes just below his neck. She had the air of someone just moments from going completely berserk if they did not get what they wanted. And then she pulled him up by his lapels until his face was only centimeters from hers. She had a death grip on his robes. "Could you tell me that?" "Please," she said through gritted teeth. It's the book manifestation spell, Hayskart's method. Twilight taught me back in Ponyville," he said, more than a little fearfully. "I told everyone about it last month, remember?" "Book manifestation spell," she repeated slowly, her grip intensifying. He had never suspected she had such strength in her hands. It must be from all those heavy books she had carried around before she had gotten the feather-lighted rucksack. "You said you found it much easier to learn. You didn't say you would actually be in the book." Harry glanced at the other students now surrounding them. About half, mostly the more senior students, had similar, though not so frightening, intense expressions. The equestrians were watching, stunned at the actions of the normally quiet and reserved witch. He nodded rapidly. "Ah, right," he squeaked out quickly. "Takes a bit of power, but it's actually rather easy to learn. I can teach you, if you want." He smiled at her, hoping that would get her to loosen her grip. He was sure he was starting to turn purple. She let go of his robes, dropping him back down into his chair. She patted his robes, straightening his lapels. "Yes, Harry," she said quietly. "I would like that very much." Her eyes were still far too wide open, and her hair, somehow was even bushier than before, blotting out everything from his view except her face. She gave him a thin smile that had absolutely no humor in it. And the promise of much violence if he didn't do what he had promised. Harry looked at the table, searching for his quill and paper. She saw where he was looking. Without moving a centimeter, she produced her own paper and quill and let them drop on the tabletop in front of Harry. "Here," she said. It took him only a few minutes to sketch out the memorized spell and its structure. "The first few times you cast it," he explained, "you won't stay in very long. It's very dependent on how much power you put into it. I can stay in only about 10 minutes at a time, right now." Less than 5 minutes later Hermione was shouting in a tinny voice, "Yes, yes, yes," and jumping in circles inside the page of her textbook. She ran off the page and deeper into the book. Those closest to the book later swore that they heard mad laughter coming out. The cohort exchanged uncertain looks and all decided not to cross the intellectual girl ever. Ron looked at him and said, "She's brilliant. Scary as bloody hell, but brilliant." Most of the rest of those at the table nodded or murmured agreement. Harry spent the rest of the evening teaching the spell to other students, and coaching them in its execution. Who, in turn, after mastering it and trying it out, taught others. By the time the first years were sent to bed, almost all Gryffindor third year and above students had conquered the spell. That left the common room oddly empty and quiet, with open books scattered everywhere, and an occasional faint tinny exclamation. There were a few students who were keeping an eye on things, just in case someone had a problem. And a dozen or two students, including Ron, still trying to perfect the spell. Harry was sure that by tomorrow evening, everyone in Gryffindor would be using the spell. And he was more than a little disgruntled to realize that he was the only one of the first years not to complete today's class assignments. The trunk tour, after their early 9 o'clock curfew, was short. There wasn't that much to show, after all. To say that Dean, Seamus, and Neville were impressed was an understatement. Ron, still trying the book manifestation spell, stayed up in their room with a sour expression after he said, "I've seen it, already." "This bathroom is huge," exclaimed Seamus. "That's not a tub, that's almost a swimming pool." "I know," said Harry, "and it's called a hot tub." He touched a button on the side of the tub and that water started bubbling. The girls insisted. "It's much better than the old washtub we used to use to scrub the tree sap off each other." The other three turned and stared at him. As ponies," Harry quickly said, feeling his face heat up as he blushed. They continued to stare. "Hey," he said, somewhat desperately, "we were little foals, then." They continued to stare. Dean, Neville, and Seamus exchanged looks with wide eyes at realizing Harry and the Fillies had become animagi at very young ages, and not just recently. Dean finally gave him a small nod. Moving along, Harry said, "Here's the kitchen." He led them out of the bathroom. After the tour, shaking his head in exasperation, he sat down and started to compose a letter. Dear Twilight. Hogwarts is weird. There are staircases everywhere at Hogwarts, wide, spiraling ones, narrow, steep, rickety ones, some change which floor they go to depending on the day, some have a vanishing step that you have to remember to jump. There is a central stairwell, with 13 staircases, in the middle of the castle. Those stairs are the most difficult to manage, as they randomly switch where they go throughout the day, sometimes even while you are on them. Hermione says Hogwarts, a history says there are 142, total. Then there are doors that won't open unless you ask politely, or tickle them in exactly the right place, and solid walls just pretending doors that aren't really doors at all. Hermione also said Hogwarts, a history claims things move around a lot. That'll make it very hard to remember where anything is. Even the people in the portraits move. That's right, the people just up and walk out of their frame into another. They're always visiting each other. There are big metal suits of armor everywhere, it seems. The twins have told me that the suits of armor walk around at night and sometimes during the day. So, you can't depend on either the portraits or the suits of armor as landmarks to find your way. Plus, there are secret passages everywhere. But how you can call something secret if everyone in your house knows where the secret passages are? Then there's Peeves. He's a poltergeist and he won't leave us alone. He's always pelting us with chalk bits, rotten fruit, smelly smoke bombs, and just about anything else he can think of to make us miserable. And where he got that bucket of tree sap I can't figure out. Fortunately, he missed us and took out a bunch of Hufflepuffs, instead. Honestly, as Hermione said, I don't see why the professors let him stay. Do you have any books that might tell us how to keep him away? As it is, we have to use our shield spells almost every time we are between classes. Which, I suppose, is good practice, at least. Then there are the ghosts. That's right, ghosts. See through, walk through, wander through walls ghosts. Each house has its own ghosts, plus there's a bunch of others that wander around. Gryffindor's ghost is Sir Nicholas de Mimsy, but everyone calls him nearly Headless Nick on account of how the headsman who was supposed to behead him didn't do a good job. There's a girl's bathroom on the second floor that's haunted. We even had a ghost for our history of magic class today. Do you have any books on ghosts? Could you send us a couple? Unfortunately, even worse than Peeves, if that is possible, is the caretaker, Argus Filch. The twins warned us about him while we were at the Weasleys. He has a scrawny, dust-colored cat with bulging, lamp-like eyes just like his. She's called Mrs. Norris. She sneaks around the castle all the time. If she sees you break a rule, or put just one hoof out of line, and she runs to Filch, who always appears, 2 seconds later. Filch knows the secret passageways of the school better than anyone and can pop up as suddenly as any of the ghosts. The older students all hate him, and many wish to punt Mrs. Norris out a window. After meeting the two, I can certainly agree. Again, why do they let someone who so obviously hates children in the school? It makes no sense. Finally, there is a forest right beside the school. It's closer than the Everfree is to Apple Bloom's house. Unfortunately, we were told, it has dark creatures like giant spiders and werewolves, people who turn into wolves once a month during the full moon and attack you, and so we're forbidden to go into it. I don't see why they say it's dangerous, though. The werewolves are wolves only once a month and giant spiders don't sound all that terrible. How big could they be? Can't be much bigger than the star spiders, or maybe Fluttershy's pet, Fuzzy Legs, I would guess. Certainly not bigger than a pumpkin. Scootaloo wants to see just how big those spiders are. Do you know any anti-spider spells? The forest doesn't have any cockatrices, hydras, chimeras, timberwolves, or even any stellar monsters like Ursa Majors or Minors. Bunch of worrywarts, if you ask me. Oh, and while we were outside the castle and looking at the forest, no, we didn't go into it, Percy was with us, we sorta accidentally let everyone with us, mostly Gryffindors, but there were several students from Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw with us, know that we could turn into ponies. Such screeching you never heard. I managed to escape their clutches for a while, but then I was caught. The girls just couldn't seem to let go of us. They kept saying how cute and adorable we were, and also how fluffy. On the other hand, ear scratches are to die for. I thought Scootaloo was going to pass out when they started scratching between her wings. Oh, by the way, that teacher I said was a ghost. Well, Scootaloo accidentally sent him on to his next great adventure, as the headmaster said. The silly git didn't know he was dead. So, now we don't have a history of magic teacher until they find a replacement. Classes are fun and boring. The magic is fun, all the note-taking is not. Sweetie Belle and I each earned points because we were the only ones who could use our magic to take notes. I've included a copy of our schedule with a few notes about the teachers on the last page of this letter. And the book manifestation spell, Hayskart's method. No one here had ever heard of such a thing, and boy did they make a fuss when they saw me use it. I spent most of the evening teaching it to the other Gryffindors. And now I'm behind on my assignments. Guess I'll get up early and do them then. Oh, and before I forget, at the welcoming feast when we arrived, the headmaster said, the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death. What is up with that? Doesn't he know that that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull? I'm surprised there isn't a queue of students waiting to go to the third floor. I did manage to talk the fillies into not having a go at it until later in the week. Love, Harry. P.S. By the way, we tried the FLU network in the trunks. While we can move between the ones here without a problem, we can't access Apple Bloom's trunk in Little Winnie. We decided we'll leave it there. We really don't need it here because the girls are all sharing one room anyway, and the 2 trunks in the witch's dormitory are enough should any pony want some alone time. Or a good soak in the tubs, as the dorms only have showers. Harry and his girlfriends were finally here, Dumbledore mused, as he prepared for bed. And they had already shaken the school. First it was helping Binns to his next great adventure, then it was revealing their animagus talents. Yes, indeed, it was going to be an interesting year at Hogwarts. He had to shake his head at the thought of their awakened talents. He had thought that this Discord chap was simply very powerful. At least, that was what he thought until the children had all transformed into their animagi. That had altered his perception. What if, instead, the wizard had simply pulled their animagus talents to the surface? There was the homorphous charm, which forced an animagus to revert. Could there be a charm to do the opposite? He had been researching that possibility since the children had shown it was an animagus talent and not a simple transformation, although he expected the search to bear no fruit. If a simple spell could bring about an animagus transformation, surely someone would have already discovered it. Unfortunately, not enough was known about how that magic worked. It had to be more than just a spell, though, as he had concluded late last month. The caster had to know in advance that the wizard or witch could transform, and then to divine what that form was. For Discord to be able to see the animagus in a person suggested that he had an NTMT knowledge of how the animagus magic worked in the first place in order to separate it from the blur of a wizard's magic. That was a level of knowledge that was breathtaking in its implications. It wouldn't require a tremendous level of power to force the transformation, just knowledge, precision, and control. And he had forced 8 wizards and witches into their forms, simultaneously, when they had no prior knowledge of their forms. He had circumvented what normally took years of study by a wizard to find and understand their animagus form, and done it in a moment. That implied a very thorough knowledge of a tremendous variety of creatures, something that would take decades of study. But there hadn't been a variety of creatures at the Weasleys' home, only ponies. For that many wizards and witches to be the same animal, beggared the imagination. Yet, here they were, all ponies. It should be impossible. He shook his head tiredly. His eyes widened in surprise at a new thought. This Discord's knowledge of the animagus magic must be complete and total. He had not only seen their animagus forms well enough to pull them to the surface without harming the wizards and witches, but he had also changed them. He had changed their animagus forms into ponies. That's why they were all variations on a pony animagus. He had the power and knowledge to change a fundamental aspect of a wizard's or witch's magic. Dumbledore couldn't even calculate the power or skill to do such a thing. He wasn't sure which was more worrying, an immensely powerful wizard, or just a powerful wizard with a fundamental understanding of magic that no other wizard had ever achieved. In either case, he was a wizard that could easily match the headmaster, if he so desired. It would be better to avoid any disagreements with the wizard, and to try to stay on his good side. Dumbledore smiled to himself. He had decades of experience at that. And then frowned at what this insight might mean about the relative power of the other Atlanteans. The thought of an entire nation with powers nearly equal to his was daunting. At breakfast the next morning there were two main topics. The first was a continuation of yesterday's furor over Gryffindor House's Technicolor talking pony animagi, underscored by their involvement with banishing Professor Binns and apparently knowing actual princesses. It soon gave over to the second topic, which was the quickly spreading rumor about bookwalking, that is, the book manifestation spell involving Harry Potter and, by extension, the mysterious three foreigners. It took only one demonstration by Percy to Penelope Clearwater, the Ravenclaw prefect, to bring the Great Hall into chaos. Percy had walked over to the other prefect, sitting with her friends, to show off the new spell. Listening to his tinny explanation from the book only long enough to hear Harry Potter's name, Penelope had almost galloped straight over to Harry. The three Ravenclaw fifth-year students who had been only casually listening, at first, had excitedly and quickly followed her. Curious, several other Ravenclaws, and the Hufflepuffs seated on the table beside them, had looked at the abandoned book and had seen Percy pacing in it while exclaiming in a tinny voice about the virtues of bookwalking. Amid loud exclamations of, "In a book! You learn faster! Harry Potter!" they had grabbed their friends and followed the original four. Percy, realizing his audience had fled, stopped the spell. Seeing a puzzled Percy reappear beside his book while his previous audience was making a beeline for the Gryffindor first years, other students began to put two and two together. In short order, it was a stampede of Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff students over to Harry, all demanding they be taught this incredibly valuable spell. It was just as a third Ravenclaw which was trying to outbid the previous two by offering to have 3 of his children no matter how many times they had to try if he would only teach her that spell immediately, that Professor Flitwick walked up with Professor McGonagall. "Quiet! Quiet!" ordered McGonagall. "What is going on here? Bookwalking. In a book. Learn faster. I must know that spell," came the chorus of answers as everyone tried to speak at the same time. "Stop," came the authoritative command. The professor looked at the group of Ravenclaws centered on her first years. She sighed softly at seeing just who the focus of their attention was. "Mr. Potter. Do please explain." While McGonagall had seemed a bit cheerier without the headmaster at the head table this morning, although she had glared at his empty chair, her expression now seemed to combine both exasperation and regret. Which was more than a bit confusing to Harry. Harry said, staring wide-eyed at the Ravenclaws pressed close behind him. They had even managed to crowd the fillies away, which was not pleasing the 3 equestrians. Scootaloo was looking ready to do violence and Sweetie Belle had her wand out. "Give him room, please," Professor McGonagall said to the Ravenclaws, making shooing motions with her hands. They reluctantly took a step back. The fillies immediately reclaimed their positions and glared at the other girls. Their glares declared to all that Harry was their friend. Harry was happy to see, even though most of his attention was on his head of house. He didn't realize that the other girls present took the message slightly differently, although the end result as they spread out was the same. They understood the unspoken message: messing with Harry would lead to unpleasant consequences for the interlopers. Harry Potter was theirs. "I guess it's about the book manifestation spell," Harry said timidly. Professor Flitwick perked up. "Book manifestation spell?" Harry nodded. "Yes, sir. It's a spell. it uses Hayscart's method, that lets you go into a book. Twilight taught it to me. Into a book, repeated the diminutive professor. Professor McGonagall's eyebrows had managed to meet her hairline. Yes, sir, Harry said nervously. Everything is much clearer when you're in the book rather than simply reading it. As Twilight says, you'd be surprised at what you learn when you're in a book. Professor McGonagall noticed that many of the upper-year Gryffindors were nodding in agreement. Professor Sprout had joined her compatriots. And you know this spell? Yes, sir. I asked Twilight to teach it to me when I learned I was going to be coming here and she wouldn't be teaching me magic anymore. I figured, if I couldn't have her, the Princess of Magic, to answer my questions, then the next best thing would be to get inside the book itself. Would you show us this spell? Professor Flitwick said. He looked as interested as the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff students, even Professors McGonagall and Sprout seemed intrigued. The nearby Gryffindors, all of whom had learned the spell last night, snickered. Again, Professor McGonagall noticed their reactions. From her brief frown, Harry suspected she knew they had already learned the spell. Harry shrugged. He picked up his rucksack and pulled out his herbology textbook. He moved his plate aside and laid the book down, open to the first chapter. He stared at it a moment, then abruptly he wasn't there anymore. The Ravenclaws all gasped. The three professors noticed that he hadn't bothered to pull out his wand. "Hi, Professor McGonagall." Harry called out in his tinny voice, waving his hand from a box on the page. Those who hadn't seen Percy in his book, were amazed to see Harry's demonstration. "My word!" Professor McGonagall said, putting a hand on her chest. Professor Flitwick jumped up onto the bench into the space Harry had vacated and stared at Harry's colorful image. "Hi, Professor Flitwick." He waved again. Being inside the book just makes things easier to understand. His tinny voice was difficult to hear. You can pick up nuances of words that don't come across when you simply read the text or look at the diagrams. It's like the difference between reading about being levitated and actually being levitated. And there aren't any irritating distractions, you can devote your full attention to learning. The Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs were muttering in the background. Half were trying to shush the other half to hear what was being said, and making more noise than the ones they were trying to hush. The closest ones were silent and stared in disbelief. The ones farther back were pushing forward and trying to look over the shoulders of the ones in front. The professor nodded his head. "What an unusual spell. Would you show me the spell? Can I finish breakfast first?" Harry asked plaintively. Professor Flitwick looked around and chuckled. "I believe we can manage that." He started making shooing motions with his hands. "All right, that's all for now. Get back to your breakfasts. Don't forget you have classes, soon." He grinned at his Ravenclaws. "I promise I'll take a good look at the spell, and if it's as useful as it sounds, I'll make sure everyone gets a chance to learn it." Somewhat mollified, the crowd began to disperse and discuss the ramifications of using the spell. The Slytherins tried to pretend to be above it all, but Harry could see their interest perk up as the Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs who had seen the demonstration explained what the fuss was about. Two of the Slytherin girls and one of the boys looked as if they were tempted to come over to the Gryffindor table immediately rather than wait for professorial approval. Penelope was making a beeline for Percy, followed by several of her friends. She, clearly, wasn't going to be waiting for any professors all clear before learning that charm. After Professor Flitwick hopped off the bench seat, Harry returned from the book. "As soon as you finish your breakfast, come see me at the head table," the professor said to Harry. "I'll give you an excused slip for Professor Sprout if we need to." Harry nodded, "Thank you, sir," and turned back to his breakfast. Not too much later, showing the charms professor how to cast the spell and then walking him through his first book didn't take much time. It also helped that he and the fillies had quickly finished their breakfasts. An excuse slip for being late to herbology wasn't needed, although the quartet did have to run to catch up with the other Gryffindors. As he had told everyone the night before, the spell was rather simple and all you needed was enough power to do it. Almost anyone with a wand could do it, they had discovered last night. Having a wand made casting a specific spell much easier, Harry had found, than just trying to cast a general spell without one. He thought that having a horn was easier than using a wand, however. After all, the horn was directly connected to the body's nervous system, mana channels, and skeletal structure. That beat a handheld wand by every measure you cared to make. The other professors listened intently, although Professor Snape seemed to think it was some kind of attention-seeking stunt, from what Harry overheard. Professor Quirrell seemed more interested in Harry than the spell itself, however. He also explained that safeties Twilight had added into the spell, as he had to the Gryffindors last night. Things such as you couldn't get trapped inside, and if there was anything in the book that could pose a danger to the spellcaster, the spell would not work. Instead, a temporary red tint would appear over the book as a warning. Plus, a basic part of the spell was that anything invoked inside the book could not manifest outside it. In addition, you would be automatically ejected from the book if you fell asleep or unconscious for any reason, if the book was moved, or if some catastrophe were to befall the book such as fire or something falling on it. Exiting the spell usually placed you right where you had been sitting or standing. If that place was blocked by something, you would exit to a nearby location where there was actually room for you to fit. He finished with its power requirement. When he had first learned it, he had managed barely half a minute. 5 points to Gryffindor, Professor Flitwick had said, for bringing such an interesting spell to my attention. Professor Snape rolled his eyes in disgust. Professor Sprout was a squat little witch with a patched and battered hat perched atop her short, grey, flyaway hair. Her work robes were already covered in dirt and earth, and her fingernails dirty. She also had a brilliant cheery smile. Come in," she said merrily, ushering them into a large greenhouse with a number 1 painted above the door. First years are only allowed in greenhouse number 1, she continued. The others contain dangerous plants such as the venomous tentacula, mandrakes, fire seed bush, and so forth. Today, we'll be going over general procedures and getting to know one another. She followed Harry in as he was the last to show up. She was only part way through her lecture about always using the correct amount of compost when Apple Bloom shrieked, followed a moment later by Ron. By the time the professor could make her way to them, both were almost buried under walking plants jumping off their nearby rack. Ron later insisted that he had not screamed like a little girl on helium, as Dean had said, but had yelled loudly in a very manly manner. The plants were small, looking like tiny versions of evergreen hedges, and none more than 3 or so inches, 7 centimeters, high. "Oh, dear. Back, the professor said as she shooed the plants away, using her wand to levitate the more reluctant plants. They've never done that before. Usually, they run away when a wizard or witch is near. She plucked a small sprout that was trying to hide in Apple Bloom's hair. Back you go, she scolded the small plant as she placed it in a planting tray in a rack with a score of its relatives. It wasn't hard to miss how the magical plants in the greenhouse always tilted towards Apple Bloom and Ron whenever they came close to one. The Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs had noticed already that those two were the only two normal ponies in the group of otherwise Pegasi and Unicorns animagi. They began to get the idea that maybe those two weren't just ponies, as they had assumed, but had some kind of connection with plants. The professor gave them a thorough tour of the greenhouse, showing them where all the tools, accessories, and supplies were, as well as the proper places for things such as cuttings and compost. The rest of the lesson was rather dull, being an overview of plant germination and how dragon dung can hinder, and rarely help, muggle plant growth unless one was very careful. Turning to look at the class from the board behind his desk, Professor Flitwick glanced across the Gryffindor students. Normally, the Gryffindors were the more difficult class to teach, no matter which house they were paired with. They were easily bored, easily distracted, and typically poor note-takers, as he later told the headmaster. A regular complaint of his. This cohort, however, seemed inordinately focused. In fact, they were definitely providing competition to the Hufflepuffs. At the rate they were going they would soon surpass the Ravenclaws. The only two students who weren't intently following along his explanation were two of the foreign girls who appeared to be chewing on their quills and doodling on their papers. They were somewhat balanced by their two friends who used their magic to take copious notes. Professor McGonagall would be happy to hear that at the staff's end of the week meeting. He returned to his lecture. He would wait for the first test before making any judgments. The Marauders had taught him that just because someone appeared disengaged, that didn't mean they didn't understand. Plus, who knew what that book manifestation spell might do in the way of study habits and lesson retention? It had been a bit disconcerting to discover that the entire Gryffindor house had managed to learn it in one evening. Not to mention that all the students he had talked to about it had reported it as a big help in learning and understanding the material. It will probably take a while to see if there is a discernible difference in the assignments, he planned to tell Albus. But anything that improved their comprehension was a plus. Tuesday afternoon, after defense against the dark arts, the Gryffindor first-year cohort moved to the library for their assignment research. They would have gone outside, but a rainstorm had moved in after lunch and hadn't cleared up, yet. Pooling their efforts worked much better than trying to work alone, as Harry and the Fillies knew. They could research several books at once, and give summaries of what they found to the others. Plus, without the worry of needing to read every book to find the information they needed, they could spend more time searching lesser-used books for tidbits of information. In addition, they didn't have to worry that the book they needed was in the hands of another student, making them waste time waiting. As a bonus, what one had trouble understanding, another always understood perfectly. And what one had trouble explaining in easy-to-understand terms, Hermione, another could translate for the rest. Neville, Dean, and Seamus had tagged along at Harry's invite, which made it 5 wizards to 9 witches, a bit better ratio as far as the boys were concerned. Although it really wasn't that terrible as usually there were several girls bookwalking at any given time, especially Hermione. As she usually finished her work first, she spent the rest of her time in a book doing other reading. At the rate she was going Harry had no doubts she would make serious inroads in reading the entire library this year. Naturally, the 3 fillies sat beside Harry. In spite of that, Harry spent most of his time teaching students from the other houses how to use the book manifestation spell. By dinner time, the table commandeered by the first-year Gryffindors hosted almost half of the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff houses' Frnds as well. Most were sitting on the floor or had pulled over chairs from other tables. After dinner, Harry discovered that having spent so much of his time teaching the spell instead of doing his assignments had a side benefit. After much begging by the older witches in Gryffindor, Hermione, Ginny, Ron, and the fillies had transformed into their pony counterparts. As a result, they were being cuddled, petted, and combed by nearly the entire house's witch population. Each of whom jealously guarded their time with each pony. Harry was able to beg off, using the excuse, assignments. And that meant he had almost uncontested access to everyone else's assignment notes. Which, in turn, meant he didn't have to worry about leaving out or missing something important. He had been worried about that because he no longer had Twilight to double-check his work. He worked slow, and made it obvious that he was double-checking his own work. This prevented the witches from accosting him and demanding he transform. He managed to drag it out until the 9 o'clock bedtime curfew hit the first years. Harry noticed, as they got ready for bed in the dorm room, that Ron seemed pretty calm and mellow, and very relaxed. He had expected the boy to be upset and riled up at being forced to be a living plush toy. On the other hand, Harry knew just how good those ear scratches felt, not to mention the tummy rubs. After all, at home Ron had to compete with his siblings for any attention. Here, he had several girls almost fighting for the privilege of cuddling him, something his mother hadn't done in years outside of momentary crushing hugs. In addition, no one could rag on him about him letting them fuss over him like that because he was simply one of many. Some of the older wizards looked jealous of the time he spent being cuddled by the older witches. He had never had anyone be jealous of him before. Wednesday started off with the Parliament of Owls, including Hedwig. Harry was delighted to see the snowy white fly down and set a package in front of him. It immediately grew to a stack of books, ribbon-wrapped together. The top one was ghosts, fact or fiction, followed by spells for ghosts, if they were real, and ghostly spells. Then came pests, small and large, and the encyclopedia of small pest control. Harry gave him a banger and some bacon. He took the banger in his beak, and grabbed the bacon with one claw. When he took off, he passed over the bacon platter and helped himself to another claw's worth before heading for the rafters to finish his dining. Scutala chortled as she grabbed the pest's books and started flipping pages. Harry and Sweetie Belle almost had to fight Hermione for the ghost's books, before Harry said, "Here, you take the thickest one, and move ghosts, fact of fiction into her hands." She was about to start bookwalking when he stopped her. "Eat breakfast first." Sighing, she propped the book open and merely read the book as she ate and continued to read it as they headed for the greenhouses. Disturbingly, Harry noticed, she walked the entire way without once looking up to see where she was going. The witch managed to not bump into anything or anyone on the way. Harry even stopped in front of her and watched as she steered around him without a misstep. She didn't even comment on him deliberately stepping in front of her. How had she picked that trick up from Twilight after only meeting her a few times at the Weasleys'? Yet more evidence she was Chui's lost twin. Harry couldn't help but snicker during class as he watched the walking plants. They would slowly creep under the tables and across the aisles as they tried to sneak up on Ron and Apple Bloom, and Professor Sprout, repeatedly, would chase them all back to their rack. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 19. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.